It happened in the blink of an eye, a sunny afternoon that turned into a nightmare I will never forget. 1 second my pregnant wife, Emily, was laughing with Karen's teenage son on the sidewalk, the next a flash of silver sliced the air and she collapsed against me, her hand flying to her neck as blood poured through her fingers. I can still hear the sickening hiss of Karen's voice, twisted with rage, screaming, "Stay away from my family," while neighbors froze in shock, their grocery bags and garden tools dropping to the pavement. Time seemed to shatter as I fumbled for my phone, screaming for someone, anyone, to call 911. Sirens were still distant when Emily's knees buckled and her eyes widened with terror for the life growing inside her. I pressed my trembling hands to her wound, feeling the warmth of her blood soak my shirt, my heart pounding louder than the shouts around me. Karen stood there, knife trembling in her grip, her face a mask of fury and fear, until she suddenly spun and bolted toward her house, slamming the door as if it could hide what she'd done. The world around us blurred into chaos, neighbors shouting, footsteps running, the faint wail of approaching sirens, while I held Emily and whispered, "Stay with me, please stay with me," praying our unborn child would survive this unthinkable attack. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more Karen stories. My name is Daniel, and before that horrifying day our lives were simple and beautiful, the kind of suburban dream many couples hope to build when starting a family. My wife Emily and I had been married for 5 years, and after years of wishing and planning we were finally expecting our first child, a little girl who was already the center of our world. Every spare moment outside of work was spent painting the nursery soft lavender, assembling tiny furniture, and daydreaming about late-night feedings and first steps. We had chosen a quiet neighborhood that seemed almost tailor-made for young families, tree-lined sidewalks where children rode bikes, friendly faces waving as you passed, and an active homeowners association that promised to keep the streets safe and the yards neat. At first, it felt like the perfect place to plant roots. Weekend barbecues and block parties introduced us to neighbors who were teachers, nurses, and retirees tending rose bushes, all eager to swap gardening tips or share fresh pies. Yet even in those early weeks, a faint shadow stretched across the sunshine. That shadow had a name, Karen. From the moment we met her, she stood apart from the easy warmth of everyone else. While others greeted us with smiles and casseroles, Karen gave us tight-lipped nods and a gaze that seemed to weigh and measure every move we made. She lived 2 houses down in a white-painted colonial with perfectly trimmed hedges and an immaculate lawn that looked like something out of a magazine, but there was an icy precision to her pride. It showed first in the little things, a scowl when our welcome balloons drifted too close to her fence, a curt reminder about recycling bins left out for an extra hour, an unsolicited email from the HOA president, also her, about proper hedge maintenance. At neighborhood gatherings, she rarely laughed, preferring to linger on the edges with her phone clutched like a shield. More than once, I caught her peering through her blinds when we worked on the nursery late at night, as if cataloging our lives. We brushed it off at first, chalking it up to personality differences. But whispers from other neighbors hinted at something deeper. An older gentleman once told me, in a lowered voice, that Karen had a history of feuds, disputes over fence heights, arguments about parking spots, even a screaming match with a family who eventually moved away. One mother mentioned she kept her children at a distance, claiming Karen's temper could flip like a switch. Emily and I took those warnings seriously but didn't let them harden our hearts. After all, every neighborhood has a difficult personality, and we believed that kindness and patience would soften hers. In fact, Emily went out of her way to greet Karen on our walks, offering a smile and gentle small talk even when Karen responded with little more than a stiff nod. But small signs of hostility kept surfacing. Karen once left a typed letter on our door, citing a rule about excessive sidewalk chatter, because Emily had stopped to talk with another neighbor's child. Another time she complained to the HOA board, where she held considerable influence, that our garden lights were distracting to drivers. These things might have seemed minor in isolation, but taken together they painted a picture of someone watching us closely, someone who resented our presence and the joy we brought to the street. We sensed a storm building, though we could never have imagined its magnitude. We told ourselves it was just neighborhood politics, a bit of tension we could smooth over with politeness and time. But as Emily's pregnancy progressed and our anticipation for the baby's arrival grew, Karen's coldness hardened into something sharper. There were moments when her eyes followed us with an intensity that made the hairs on my neck stand up, and I'd find myself wondering what history or secret pain could make a person carry so much bitterness in a place meant for peace. We couldn't know then that those subtle warning signs, those cold stares and carefully worded complaints, were the early tremors of the earthquake about to shake our world to its core. From the moment Emily's pregnancy reached its 6th month, the tension with Karen began to thicken like storm clouds that refused to break, and what once seemed like harmless quirks hardened into daily confrontations that tested every ounce of patience we had. It started with something so small we nearly laughed it off, a folded piece of paper tucked beneath our doormat one quiet Monday morning, typed in neat, bold letters that read, "Please refrain from extended conversations on the sidewalk. This is a quiet, family-oriented street." At first we exchanged confused glances, thinking it might have been a mix-up, but the paper was signed with Karen's unmistakable looping initials. We shrugged and promised ourselves we'd keep our chats with neighbors brief, but that was only the beginning. 2 days later, Emily returned from an evening walk pale and unsettled, explaining that Karen had confronted her mid-stroll, accusing her of blocking foot traffic while talking to another mother. Emily described how Karen's voice had risen sharp enough to draw curious stares from passing joggers, and how she ended with an icy threat, "Some of us take the HOA rules seriously. Maybe you should too." I called the HOA president's office that night, only to learn Karen herself held the title, which meant every formal complaint landed squarely on her desk. Still hoping to calm things down, I suggested we keep our distance, but Karen wasn't content to leave us alone. Over the next week, new letters appeared like clockwork, one objecting to the faint music from our backyard barbecue, another warning that unauthorized gatherings might incur a fine. Each note felt like a tiny invasion, a reminder that she was watching, and by the 3rd week neighbors began to murmur about emergency HOA meetings that Karen was suddenly calling. We weren't invited to those gatherings, but whispers reached us anyway. She had started claiming that Emily, by pausing to chat with neighborhood kids, was creating a hazard and even endangering children by distracting them near the road. It was absurd, but the way she said it, neighbors recounted, made it sound urgent and believable. One evening, a friendly couple stopped us to quietly warn that Karen was rallying a small group to demand disciplinary action, language that sounded less like neighborly concern and more like a witch hunt. But that wasn't her last warning. A few days later, as Emily watered the hydrangeas in our front yard, Karen marched over uninvited, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and something darker. "I don't know what game you're playing," she hissed, "but you will not lure my son into your gossiping circles. He's a good boy and I won't have him corrupted by strangers." Emily, gentle but firm, reminded her we had only exchanged polite greetings with the teenager, but Karen's eyes burned with a fury that left Emily shaken long after she retreated behind her door. I tried to reason with her the following day, knocking politely and offering to talk things through. Karen opened the door only wide enough to glare. "Your wife is dangerous," she said flatly. "If she keeps approaching my son, you'll both regret it." The door slammed before I could answer. From that point on, the tension wrapped around our daily life like barbed wire. We'd catch sight of her staring from her window whenever Emily stepped outside, phone in hand as though documenting every move. Neighbors reported she'd been canvassing the street with exaggerated tales of Emily harassing her child. Even the HOA newsletter carried a veiled message about the importance of respecting personal boundaries, clearly aimed at us. We debated filing a formal harassment complaint but worried it might inflame things further. We even considered installing extra cameras and lights, a thought that left Emily uneasy. Our home was supposed to be a place of joy, not a fortress. Yet each attempt to ignore her only seemed to feed her obsession. One Saturday morning, as I was loading groceries from the car, Karen appeared at the edge of our driveway, snapping photos of our license plate. When I confronted her, she claimed we were parking too close to the curb and that she had documentation for the board. My voice cracked with restrained anger as I told her to stop, but she only smirked and walked away. That night Emily and I sat on the couch, our unborn daughter kicking softly as if sensing our fear, and wondered how far Karen might go. We began to live in a quiet state of alert, double-checking locks, glancing over our shoulders on evening walks, pausing before opening the door when the bell rang. Friends and family urged us to report her escalating behavior, but something in Karen's eyes during those encounters suggested she thrived on conflict, that legal steps might only fuel the fire. We told ourselves that maybe after the baby arrived she'd lose interest or find another target. We desperately wanted to believe that the worst she could do was write letters or make false complaints. But beneath that hope a cold certainty grew. Karen's fixation was spiraling into something we didn't yet have a name for, and every quiet moment felt like the breathless pause before a storm finally breaks. The breaking point came on a breezy Saturday afternoon in early spring, a day that should have been nothing more than a quiet walk filled with the smell of freshly cut grass and the laughter of children riding their bikes, but instead became the day our lives split into a before and after that can never be stitched back together. Emily and I had decided to take a slow stroll around the block to ease her back pain and let our baby feel the movement she seemed to love. The neighborhood was alive with small weekend rhythms, neighbors trimming hedges, dogs chasing tennis balls, the faint sound of someone's radio carrying old rock songs through the warm air. Emily wore a soft blue maternity dress that fluttered lightly in the breeze, and she carried a small bottle of water I had insisted on packing. We were only halfway down the sidewalk when we spotted Karen's teenage son leaning against a tree with his headphones on. Emily, always gentle and neighborly despite everything, offered a cheerful smile and said something as simple as, "Hey, how's school going?" The boy barely looked up, mumbling a polite reply, but that brief exchange was enough to trigger the nightmare. From the corner of my eye, I caught a sudden movement, the side door of Karen's house slamming open like a gunshot. Karen stormed out with a speed and fury that made my stomach drop, her eyes blazing with an intensity one had never seen even in our worst confrontations. "I told you to stay away from my family," she shouted, her voice cracking with rage as she marched across the lawn. Before I could respond or even fully process what was happening, she closed the distance between us with terrifying speed, her hand hidden in the pocket of her cardigan. I instinctively stepped in front of Emily, lifting a hand in a desperate gesture for calm. "Karen, please, we were just saying hello," but she cut me off with a scream so sharp it felt like broken glass in the air. In that split second, she yanked her hand free, and the glint of sunlight off cold metal made my heart seize. It was a knife, small but wickedly pointed, and she lunged forward before I could react. Everything slowed to a surreal crawl, the sound of Emily's gasp, the metallic flash of the blade, the sickening thud as it met soft flesh. Karen drove the knife into the side of Emily's neck with a force I will feel in my nightmares for the rest of my life. Emily let out a strangled cry, staggering against me as bright red blood surged between her fingers and down the front of her dress. For a fraction of a second I froze, disbelief locking my limbs, and then panic roared through me like fire. I grabbed Emily, pulling her back, shouting her name over and over while neighbors screamed and phones began to ring. Karen stood a foot away, her chest heaving, eyes wild and unfocused, the knife trembling in her grip. "You won't ruin us," she hissed, as if she were somewhere else entirely, trapped in a reality only she could see. "You won't touch my son." Her words barely registered over the rushing sound in my ears. Blood soaked my shirt as I clamped both hands over Emily's wound, feeling the frantic flutter of her pulse beneath my palms. Stay with me," I begged, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind screamed with the unspoken terror for the tiny heartbeat inside her. "Call 911. Somebody call 911 now." I yelled to the circle of stunned neighbors who had begun to gather, their faces masks of shock and horror. Somewhere in the background I heard sirens start to wail, distant but approaching. Karen suddenly stepped back, her expression twisting between rage and something like fear, and then she turned and ran, darting across her lawn, flinging open her door, and slamming it behind her with a force that rattled the glass. The entire street seemed to hold its breath in that moment. I lowered Emily carefully to the grass, keeping pressure on the wound as she whimpered, her breath coming in shallow, frightened gasps. Her eyes locked on mine, wide with a fear that cut deeper than the knife. "The baby," she whispered, and my heart nearly shattered. "Don't talk," I told her, my own voice breaking, "just hold on. Help is coming. Our baby is strong. You're strong." My neighbor, a retired EMT named Brian, knelt beside me, hands steady as he ripped open a first aid kit and passed me gauze. Another neighbor kept me updated on the ambulance's location, shouting into his phone. The world around us blurred into fragments, someone sobbing behind me, a child crying, the sirens growing louder. I focused on keeping pressure on the wound, on whispering every reassuring word I could muster. "I love you. You're going to be okay. Our daughter is going to be okay." The minutes felt endless, every second a battle against the spreading crimson on Emily's neck and dress. When the ambulance finally screeched to a halt and paramedics rushed out with equipment, I felt my knees nearly give way in relief. They moved with quick, practiced precision, one cutting away fabric to assess the injury while another started in four. I barely registered their questions as they prepared to lift Emily onto a stretcher. I only remember the brief squeeze of her hand and the soft, determined look she gave me, as if to say she was still fighting for both of them. Even as they carried her into the ambulance, the chaos didn't fully hit me until I caught sight of Karen's door still shut tight across the street. Police officers were pounding on it, their voices sharp, but she didn't answer. It was as if she thought a wooden door could erase the violence she had unleashed. I climbed into the ambulance, clutching Emily's free hand as the sirens wailed to life, the city blurring past in streaks of light. Fear for my wife and unborn child filled every breath. I tried to push away the image of Karen's wild eyes and the knife flashing in the sun, but it replayed in an endless loop. I whispered promises to Emily that we would make it through this, that our baby would see the world we had dreamed of for her, even as dread knotted in my chest. The hospital loomed ahead like a desperate hope, and I held on to it with everything I had, knowing that the nightmare was far from over. The weeks that followed were a draining maze of hospital corridors, legal meetings, and sleepless nights that tested every ounce of strength Emily and I had left, a stretch of time where every sunrise brought both gratitude for survival and a fresh wave of frustration that justice seemed to move slower than a wounded heart could heal. Emily remained in the hospital for nearly 2 weeks as doctors carefully monitored the wound in her neck and the precious life she carried, and while the surgery had saved both mother and child, the ordeal left her weak, in pain, and haunted by flashes of the attack that sometimes jolted her awake in tears. Our unborn daughter's heartbeat was strong and steady, a blessing that kept us going, but the joy of feeling her tiny kicks was mixed with the constant shadow of what might have been. Outside the hospital room, the world felt less like a community and more like a cold machine built to delay and deflect. Karen had immediately lawyered up and, from the safety of her house, began spinning a story so distorted it might have been fiction. Through whispered conversations and carefully worded HOA emails, she claimed that Emily had provoked her, that she only acted in self-defense, and that the real aggressors were outsiders like us who didn't respect community standards. Some of our neighbors, people we had once shared laughter and dinners with, chose silence or worse, quietly sided with her, worried more about property values and neighborhood reputation than the fact that a pregnant woman had nearly lost her life. I learned that Karen had deep ties within the HOA board and even a distant cousin on the city zoning committee, and while those connections didn't give her immunity, they certainly slowed every attempt to hold her accountable. Detectives told me the case needed to be airtight. Without clear video of the stabbing or a neighbor willing to testify they had seen the blade enter Emily's neck, defense lawyers would argue endless, reasonable doubt. I nearly shouted when an investigator said, "We have to be careful. Her attorney will claim you're exaggerating for attention." How could anyone think this was an exaggeration when I had held my wife's blood-soaked body on a suburban sidewalk? Yet day after day the process crawled, subpoenas for phone records, endless interviews, back and forth between prosecutors and Karen's attorney. Each court date felt like a mirage, postponed again and again by legal maneuvers that Karen's well-paid lawyers seemed to pull from a bottomless bag of tricks. Meanwhile, our finances bled. Hospital bills arrived like clockwork, followed by invoices for emergency surgery, neonatal monitoring, and counseling to help Emily cope with the trauma. Insurance covered some but not all, and my paid leave from work vanished quickly. Family and close friends stepped in with meals and small donations, their kindness a thin but vital lifeline. Yet even with that support, every trip to the mailbox carried a new reminder of how violence ripples long after the sirens fade. The emotional toll was heavier still. Emily, normally a beacon of calm and optimism, wrestled with anxiety and nightmares. She flinched at sudden noises, avoided the windows facing Karen's house, and sometimes gripped my hand until her knuckles whitened when we walked outside. I tried to be her rock, but inside I was battling my own rage and helplessness. I wanted to shout at the world that this was attempted murder, not a neighborhood spat. Instead, I found myself filling out forms, waiting on callbacks, and explaining the same horrific scene to different officials who all nodded sympathetically while warning me that these things take time. Even the small victories were bittersweet. When a neighbor finally admitted to police that they had heard Karen screaming threats seconds before the stabbing, the prosecutor called it helpful but not decisive. When a security camera from a house across the street revealed Karen running home clutching something metallic, the defense argued it didn't conclusively show a weapon. Each piece of evidence felt like a brick in a wall we were building against her lies, but the wall grew painfully, excruciatingly slow. Through it all, Emily refused to let despair win. She began writing letters to our unborn daughter, telling her about courage, about the power of truth, and about the fierce love that had carried us through the darkest hours. Reading those letters beside her hospital bed renewed my resolve. I gathered every scrap of documentation, hospital records, neighbor statements, audio snippets from 911 calls, and pushed prosecutors to see the bigger picture: months of harassment, escalating threats, and finally the violent act itself. We were not just fighting for justice, we were fighting for the future safety of our child and every neighbor Karen might target next. Yet the cruelest injustice wasn't only in the slow-moving legal system or the whispered gossip that tried to muddy the truth. It was in the knowledge that Karen slept in her own bed every night while Emily lay in a hospital gown stitched with fresh scars, that she watered her perfect lawn while we struggled to pay for trauma therapy, and that she still wielded influence over an HOA that should have protected us. The contrast was almost unbearable. Some nights, as Emily slept fitfully and our baby shifted under the thin blanket, I stared out the hospital window and vowed that no matter how long it took, I would see this through to the end. We might have been battered by violence and bureaucracy, but we were not broken, and the quiet strength growing in Emily's womb reminded me that even in the face of injustice, life and love could still rise stronger than fear. Just when it felt like Karen's lies might stretch the case into oblivion, a glimmer of hope came from the most unexpected place: a quiet knock on our door late one evening about 3 weeks after Emily's release from the hospital. I opened it to find Mark, the usually reserved delivery driver who serviced our street, standing awkwardly on the porch with a small external hard drive clutched in his hand. He explained that on the day of the attack he had been running behind schedule and parked his truck on the corner across from Karen's house, right where his dashcam, running continuously for insurance purposes, faced the sidewalk. He had heard rumors about what happened but assumed police already had every angle of footage until his company's routine data check revealed something chilling. "I think this might help," he said, his eyes serious as he handed me the drive. I thanked him with a gratitude so fierce it nearly broke me and spent that night transferring the video to my laptop. What we saw left no room for doubt: crystal clear footage of Karen bursting from her side door, knife gleaming in her hand, charging at Emily and plunging it toward her neck. The camera even captured the aftermath: her wild-eyed retreat and the knife still visible as she sprinted back inside. It was the missing piece we had prayed for. Early the next morning, armed with this new evidence, we met with the lead detective and the district attorney. The mood in the conference room shifted the moment the footage began to play. Detectives leaned forward, prosecutors exchanged sharp glances, and when the video ended the DA simply said, "This changes everything." Within 48 hours, a warrant was issued for Karen's arrest on charges of attempted murder, aggravated assault, and using a deadly weapon. The news traveled fast. By evening, squad cars lined our street, red and blue lights reflecting off the perfectly trimmed hedges of Karen's white colonial home. Neighbors peeked from windows as officers knocked and then entered, escorting Karen out in handcuffs while she shouted about conspiracies and doctored evidence. The woman who had once wielded HOA power like a weapon now stood small and frantic under the cold flash of camera phones. That arrest set off a domino effect inside the HOA. Board members who had defended her began scrambling to distance themselves, and long-silenced neighbors came forward with their own stories of intimidation, harassing emails, late-night confrontations, petty fines that seemed to target anyone who questioned her. The board called an emergency meeting and, for the first time since we moved in, invited us to speak. With the video paused on the frame of Karen lunging forward, I told the assembled crowd about months of escalating harassment and the fear Emily lived with every day. Faces that once looked doubtful now showed shame and outrage. By the meeting's end, the board voted unanimously to remove Karen as president and ban her from holding any future HOA position. The legal process that once felt endless now gathered unstoppable momentum. The prosecutor's office prepared a case that not only included the stabbing but also chronicled Karen's long pattern of threats, false reports, and abuse of power. They used neighbor statements, old complaint letters, and even HOA emails to show a chilling escalation from verbal harassment to physical violence. When the trial date was set, I felt a weight lift for the first time since that terrible afternoon. Emily, still carrying our healthy baby girl, testified with quiet strength, her voice steady as she described the moment the knife pierced her skin and the terror that followed. The dashcam video played for the jury, silencing the courtroom except for the sound of Karen's own scream captured on tape. Even Karen's lawyer, who had argued so fiercely for self-defense, faltered when confronted with the undeniable clarity of that footage. By the time closing arguments ended, the case that once seemed fragile and slow had become unshakable. What began as a nightmare of injustice transformed into a precise and unstoppable path toward accountability, all because a single stranger with a running dashcam chose to step forward. The courtroom was silent except for the soft shuffle of papers and the low hum of the overhead lights as the jury filed back in, every face tense with the weight of what they had seen and heard over the past week. Emily sat beside me, one hand resting protectively over the life growing inside her, her chin lifted with quiet courage. Across the room, Karen looked like a shadow of the woman who had once strutted around our neighborhood issuing threats and fines. Her immaculate hair was unkempt, her blazer wrinkled, and her eyes darted from the jury box to the floor as if she could find an escape route in the pattern of the tiles. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution had painted a devastatingly clear picture of her escalating obsession, beginning with petty complaints and culminating in a vicious, unprovoked attack that nearly cost 2 lives. The dashcam video had been the final nail, its unflinching clarity showing her bursting from her house, knife in hand, and striking without hesitation. Even the defense's desperate arguments about self-defense and temporary emotional disturbance crumbled under the combined weight of neighbor testimony, HOA emails, and Karen's own threatening letters. When the judge finally asked the foreperson for the verdict, the words, "guilty of attempted murder and aggravated assault," rang out like a bell of long-delayed justice. A collective breath filled the courtroom, followed by a hushed murmur as Karen let out a strangled sound, half sob, half scream, and sank into her chair, her lawyer's hand on her shoulder the only thing keeping her upright. The judge wasted no time, citing the brutality of the attack and the months of harassment that preceded it as he sentenced her to a lengthy prison term with no chance of early release. For the first time since the stabbing, I felt the tight band of fear around my chest loosen, replaced by a powerful surge of relief and gratitude. Reporters clustered near the courthouse steps as we left, their questions drowned by the cheers of supportive neighbors who had finally stepped into the light, some tearful as they apologized for their silence. The HOA board announced it would pay for Emily's medical bills and implement sweeping reforms to prevent another tyrant from rising. Even more astonishing, a mental health evaluation revealed that Karen had long refused treatment for severe paranoia and delusional disorder, details that explained her spiraling rage but could not excuse her violence. Knowing the truth brought a strange peace. She hadn't been a mysterious monster, just a deeply unwell person whose unchecked power turned deadly. As Emily and I stood outside holding hands, the autumn sun warming our faces, I realized that justice wasn't just about Karen being led away in handcuffs, it was about the life we still had, the baby kicking beneath Emily's heart, and the neighborhood slowly finding its courage and conscience again. Months later, as autumn leaves blazed gold and red outside our window, life finally began to feel whole again, a slow but steady return to normal that reminded us every day how close we had come to losing everything. Emily's neck healed beautifully, leaving only a faint scar she calls her warrior mark, and every time I trace it gently with my fingers I feel an overwhelming gratitude that she and our daughter survived. Our baby girl arrived healthy and perfect, her first cry washing away months of fear and sleepless nights. Holding her in my arms for the first time felt like a sunrise breaking through the darkest storm. Together we rebuilt the small joys Karen had tried to steal: quiet morning walks, laughter echoing in the kitchen, neighbors dropping by with casseroles not out of pity but friendship renewed. The HOA that once seemed like Karen's personal weapon transformed too, creating new safeguards to protect families and opening meetings to transparency and dialogue, a community determined never again to let one person's paranoia endanger lives. Through counseling and support groups, Emily and I learned to turn trauma into strength, to speak openly about the importance of vigilance and of standing up for one another even when it's uncomfortable. We know now that silence can be dangerous, and that courage sometimes begins with a single voice refusing to back down. Looking at our daughter asleep in her crib, I often think of how easily this story could have ended in tragedy, and I'm reminded that justice is not just a courtroom verdict, it's a daily choice to protect what matters and to stand for truth. If you believe justice must always win, smash that subscribe button and share this story so no Karen ever gets away again, and let's build a world where neighbors protect each other and no one has to fear stepping outside their own home.